Hey, everybody, welcome. I'm so excited to be here. I have Andrew Westerkamp, who is the CEO of Real Isolates LLC. I believe you're out of Boston and Massachusetts, and I'm real happy to have you here. We spoke, about a month or two ago, had a really good talk, and I thought it would be really good to invite him on. I am interested in following up on some of our conversation, Andrew, that we had on botanical synergy. So we'll definitely touch on that a little bit today. But why don't I allow you to introduce yourself, introduce your company, tell us a little bit about what you guys do and what is kind of new and interesting that you're doing right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Andy Westerkamp. I also really enjoyed my conversation with you a few weeks ago. I'm glad we're doing this now. One thing to edit: I am not the CEO. Actually, I'm just a co-founder and vice president, and inventor of the technology. And maybe they say necessity is the mother of invention, right? I've got some personal health issues that were kind of the precipice for going down this road. But yeah, no, we are Real Isolates. We're located just north of Boston. We study the transformation of cannabinoids by heat, specifically when you smoke or vaporize. So our interest is in actually plant-derived smoke and fungus-derived smoke, and the secondary metabolites and interesting combinations of compounds found in the smoke of these plants that have been used for, millennia for medicinal purposes. There's 1,000 plus smoked for medicinal purposes, and that's our area of interest.
Fascinating, fascinating. I am not so familiar with fungally smoked. Tell me more about that. That's very interesting for me.
Well, what I can say is you can smoke pretty much anything, which is a funny subject in general. It's very provocative and it's a little bit taboo to think that anything smoked is medicinal in any way. But yeah, there's a variety of mushrooms, of course, in the world that are edible. And there are some that are smokable, which sounds funny because, of course, you've got some concerns about inhaling like fungal spores into your lungs. But there are transformations that happen with heat with all these materials. And we have an interest in studying them because we have a selective capture method. So, as far as a human smoking something, maybe you don't want to smoke some kind of mushroom that you find out there, but there could be some benefits in there that could be studied in a controlled, safe fashion like this. So
Some of these fungal compounds have boiling points or temperature points that are similar to the cannabinoids so that they could be put in a vaporizer, or are you guys just really focusing on just let's getting these molecules out and seeing what happens to them under these different heat pressures?
correct. Yep. So basically, we've got a Bible, so to speak, a book of 1,000 plus well documented plants and fungus that have been smoked for medicinal purposes. And our interest is, again, in finding out what is in the smoke of these things and why these groups of people chose to use those for particular reasons. So we're really just brushing the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, by identifying or even starting to identify some of the things found. But past research on smoke of most of these substances has been on what is potentially harmful or negative about it. Like I said before, right? If you smoke something that's fungus material, you have a real concern about inhaling spores and causing some sort of like lung infection or something like that. So beyond that, we are mostly just interested in capturing these secondary metabolites in the smoke of these materials and learning what they are and why they might be helping people.
Fantastic, fantastic. So when I think of combining things, and maybe we should steer away from the inhalation piece, but
Sure.
it just makes me think of some of the powwow blends that I have heard of and tried some before. One of which was a Native American mixture that had both tobacco, which I'm not a fan of, but it was a ceremonial piece,
Mhm.
and mullein leaf, amongst other things. And part of what happens with the mullein leaf, which you guys may or may not know, and I don't know if that's part of your spectrum or not, but mullein leaf inhaled has some bronchodilating properties that can counteract the bronchoconstricting aspect of the tobacco. And also, it's just a side topic, but cannabis is a part of what I have done in the past, so I don't mind talking about it.
Mhm.
Um, utilizing products with cannabis inhalation, I think, is very interesting, both on the recreational side and perhaps also on the medical side. What do you think of that, and does that relate to anything that you guys
100%.
are
Yeah,
doing?
that perfectly relates to what we're doing. You know, if I relate to your experience, which I've not done, what you're talking about, but of course I've smoked blunts, right, a million times, and those are things that are regularly consumed in the cannabis
Okay,
culture. I know you can't buy them at a store because you can't mix tobacco with cannabis in a traditional, legal setting, but it's been well known that a blunt does feel different. And we have some suspicions on why, of course, right? You've got tobacco in there. The tobacco leaf is going to burn. There's nicotine in there. That turns into a variety of different compounds, and those mixed with the traditional cannabis that you're used to smoking are going to feel different, and there's pharmacology behind that. So this is right up our alley, for sure. And I've heard similar
awesome,
things about not mullen, not just mullen leaf, but a variety of different leaves, especially south of the border, down in like Colombia and areas like this, where people are doing certain ceremonies and burning and inhaling just the smoke from tobacco, not even in a cigarette form, but in other fashions as
fascinating.
well. Because beyond the actual, scientific and pharmacological properties of these compounds and the mixtures and all that, there is a serious religious and ceremonial aspect to smoke in general. Just right down to, you know, the idea that the smoke represents like spirits, and the smoke is used in incense form in religious settings, and there's a lot here. There's a lot of mystery behind it, but that's what we're interested in. Maybe we won't learn
Uh-huh.
everything about what's in these smoked materials, but it's fascinating.
100%. And it's interesting, tobacco is a ceremonial herb that had
Mhm.
been used for centuries, and the passing of the pipe, and it was a communal as well as partially individualistic. So I find that to be fascinating. And tobacco also gets involved with acetylcholine physiology, and that can enhance the recreational and head high effect of cannabis. It also has a downside on the abuse and addiction potential. If you are trying to cut back on your cannabis use, but you've always used it in conjunction with tobacco, which is the European model,
Mhm.
it can make getting off of the substances a little bit more challenging. What I also find interesting are some of the big studies that have been done on, because nobody's saying that the smoke is good for us, but in some of the potential possible anti-cancer mechanisms of cannabis smoke as opposed to tobacco smoke. And there's some very interesting epidemiologic studies with Donald Tashkin as a researcher that's top of my mind, coming to mind, looking at different cancer rates for tobacco smokers versus folks who either use tobacco and cannabis separately or also combine them together. So it's just real fascinating. This touches on the concept of synergy. One of
Yep.
the areas of synergy is mitigating negative side effects. It's also, we talked a little bit about tobacco and its acetylcholine effects, combining with cannabis to magnify an effect that we're looking for, but herbs can also take down the negative side effects as well.
No, that's a great point. I mean, when you consider the combinations, right? I mean, first of all, to touch on the European model, I lived in the UK for a little while, and pretty much everyone that I smoked cannabis with there smoked it with tobacco, even if it was in a pipe or a bong or something like that. Everybody mixed it
Was
with
it mostly hash, Andy, or was there flour in there?
oh, cannabis flower. Yep, cannabis flower and
Okay.
tobacco just rolled into a joint or something like that. But
Mhm.
I was surprised by that. Obviously, I've been exposed to it prior to living there, but it was the main way to consume cannabis. It was always in conjunction with tobacco, pretty much most of the time, 90+% of the time. And I thought that was fascinating, but mostly because you get a different buzz, right? It's not just going to be
True.
what you're
It's
getting
very
from tobacco.
true.
Lifts you up a little bit. So if people are prone to getting anxiety or paranoia, maybe the tobacco will kick in and give you a little bit of that buzz to make you feel a little bit less
Hmm,
like that.
hmm.
Not to
Interesting.
suggest that it's a great option or something that I would recommend medically for people. I'm not a medical doctor or anything like that, but I get where you're coming from. I mean, there are things that you can combine to get a different result. So
And I'm so surprised that this conversation took this turn because I was not ready for it. But I just had not heard of the smoking of the mushrooms before, and I think that's where we took this site.
Yeah.
I won't name the country, but I spent a significant amount of time in this country where cannabis was illegal at the time, and I did not really have access to flower. All that I had access to was hashish.
Hmm.
And I did not like the personally combining it with the tobacco because I always got such a big tobacco buzz from that. And so I
Yeah.
was not used to that. And one day we went to, there was a concert, Lou Reed concert, believe it or not. And I noticed the profoundly different effects from the flower versus from the hashish, which is, a type of a concentrate. Anyway,
Yep.
um, so how to steer this conversation more towards some cutting edge things that you can talk about that you guys are doing.
Well, let's talk about this. Hashish versus flower, right? You're starting out with a material that has less components in it, right? You've removed the plant material. You're talking about just less material in general, but less compounds present. And the compounds not only are going to transform individually into a variety of other compounds when smoked and applied, to heat, which I'll get into in a sec, but they also catalyze reactions with each other. So some of them can be catalysts for different conversions and different reactions that are happening. So there is a reason to believe that just straight up from, you know, actually profiling and looking at the smoke of a flower versus a hash, you're going to have a different effect from those two different, those two different materials. Uh, just purely based on the amount of the amount of cannabinoids, terpenes, fatty, plant molecules, all sorts of stuff that's in the actual plant, different from what's in the hash. So that probably is overcomplicating a simple thing. Hash does feel different than flower, but it feels more similar to flower than some other concentrates, and there's a reason for that as well. It's coming from the flower, right? And I digress, but basically, there's three things happening when you're smoking, whether it's hash, whether it's flower, whether it's tobacco. It doesn't matter what it is. We're experiencing a combination of pyrolysis, thermal degradation, and combustion. And all three of those things are going to be doing slightly different things, but one thing they share in common is that they're going to create chemical transformations. So to relate this to what we do and why we call ourselves Real Isolates, we've confused a lot of people with our name. People assume that we create isolates and sell them. We don't. We actually purchase isolates, isolated cannabinoids and isolated compounds, to burn them or vaporize them at temperatures similar to smoking or to vaporizing to see how they change and what they turn into. And our first ever project and our first ever experiment that we did was we took CBD isolate. It was readily available, obviously. This was, a few years ago when it was really popular. And we burned it in a dab rig with a thermocoupler to control the temperature to be about 800 to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, for reference, basically the temperature of a cherry on a bowl or an ember on a joint.
Huh.
And at that temperature, CBD isolate confirmed 99+% pure, even with NMR in our lab, turned into 18 different cannabinoids. The light bulb moment from there on was, look, I mean, we were taking these isolates to do this for control, to say, all right, well, if we have XYZ components in the starting material and each one of them is potentially going to turn into these things, which one of them and which combinations of them are going to create other, formulations in smoke that might contribute to certain effects? And that was a big moment for us. We said, holy cow. I mean, we've all been under the impression that basically the difference between smoking and eating an edible in cannabis, for example, which is our specialty in here, is absorption and metabolism. One's going in through the lungs, it's kicking in quickly, and may not first pass metabolize into 11 hydroxy, and the other one's going in through your GI tract. It delivers metabolizing, THC into 11 hydroxy, and it's different. No one ever talks about the fact that we're using extremely high temperatures when we even vaporize, but when we smoke, a Bic lighter, for example, burns at 2,000 plus degrees Fahrenheit. You apply that straight onto this plant material or this hash or the isolate or whatever it is you're smoking, that is a significantly higher temperature than you would ever see in a traditional extraction, for example. And it's worth noting. I mean, when you burn stuff, it changes. We know this, right? But it's really
Fascinating.
it's tip of the iceberg, as I said before. I mean, there is a variety of products out there to look at with this. And
So just to clarify, when you heated the CBD to combustion temperatures, they were transformed into other cannabinoids, not just other non-cannabinoid molecules. That reminds me of an oral study on CBD and simulated gastric juice, which is some stomach acid,
yep,
where CBD in the test environment was changing into THC in this simulated, and then it was tried. Then people were like, "Whoa, is this happening in humans?" There were a couple of small studies in humans saying no, that it's different. But the point being is that a lot of what we do as humans to these molecules when we consume them is can be transformative, and that can include putting them in with alcohol or extracting them with alcohol, etc. Now, you
yep.
mentioned more of what you guys do is on the edible side, or is it on the inhalation side? I want to get that clear for the listeners out there.
Of course, yeah. So specifically, what we do is we've patented a method, right? It's a process of removing compounds from the smoke of plant and fungus material. So we provide a technology and intellectual property for people to perform research or to manufacture products, for example, in the cannabis industry, that would be smoke extracts. So the combination that you would find from the
Aha.
smoke, not from the plant, is what you capture with our method. And then you could make, cannabis infused products with those extracts. The idea there being that whether it's an edible or anything else, you can capture those cannabinoid profiles that are only found in the smoke that people are consuming when they smoke, and now put those into other things like an edible, for example. So if you ate an edible that's pure THC, that's a particular feeling that a lot of people are accustomed to now. If you eat an edible that has the profile of smoking the plant material that was made, that is going to feel a lot more like smoking than it is like an edible.
Curious. That's so curious. And I have always been more of a fan of how THC affects me as an inhalation as opposed to an edible. I personally do not like edibles. It's just
Me,
for me, and I know a lot of other people do.
me too.
Um,
I mean, they
uh,
certainly have convenience, and dosage is great, and there's a lot of things about edibles that are desirable. But I feel the same way, and a lot of
mhm,
people do too. You look at global cannabis revenue, large majority of it is smokable, inhalable products. You look at consumer
mhm.
preference surveys, large majority of them, like 75+% on average, say they prefer the effects of smoking. And we think that's
But-
basically because these transformations. And actually, quick fun fact before I forget: when you smoke THC forward cannabis, you're not actually inhaling a bunch of THC. You're transforming most of the THC into CBN and THC derivatives. You're still going to consume delta 9 THC, no doubt, but there is far less than we all thought before, I think.
Fascinating. Okay. So, and for me personally, I, in my heady days, as I like to call them, I really prefer in a social setting, I preferred, I should use the past tense, joints or pre-rolls. But if it was me, myself, and I in a deep dark forest or a beach or just hanging out in my own place, I like the bong. I felt that I got a different head high from each one, much more so than a pipe. I'm wondering if those are temperature variant possibilities. Who knows?
Yes.
But I want to ask you a question and preface it with I've been doing some educating on synergy and plant synergies because I think that a lot of people in the cannabis world don't, there are things that would be helpful for more people to understand. So, uh, do you see plant synergy as a thing? And if so, how do you see that as playing out in either what you guys are doing at Real Isolates or just in the cannabis world in general?
Yes, I definitely do see it as a thing, and I think it's extremely important to consider for a bunch of different reasons, namely that this subject that we're focused on has been largely ignored. And if a large majority of the money alone, if we just look at that for one sec, is being made on smokable and inhalable material, and we don't really know what anybody is consuming. I mean, we kind of do. There's been some studies on it, but not a lot. That's important by itself. And there are crazy complex mixtures in the smoke of these materials that have not been well understood or well studied. So I think at a minimum, it's important and a thing because it needs to be looked at more seriously. But also, if you look back, and I'm not a pharmacologist, but I've done a lot of reading. For instance, CBD and THC. We do know that CBD modulates the effects of THC, and we do know that it changes the way that it's received by the receptors. That's important, right? Because my understanding is that small changes in pharmacology can create, or excuse me, small changes in molecules and the way they interact can create big changes in pharmacology. That's my general knowledge and consensus of this. You can correct me if I'm way off base here, but that's why I
I
think this is important.
I think it's very important, and for example, just more clarification on that. Typically, we we forget that CBD is landing on an inactive part of the TH1 receptor, sorry, CB1 receptor, on the inactive part, not the part that makes the downstream chemical cascade that leads to a psychedelic or a psychoactive effect. But what it does when it lands on that particular location is it changes the conformation of the receptor slightly, so the THC is interacting with it differently. And we also know that other terpenes can be affecting cannabinoid receptors, such as beta caryophyllene and others. So the change of one thing can create a dramatic effect. That could be a change in temperature. It could be a change in shelf life of the product. It's fascinatingly complex and extremely fuzzy, but we can draw some basic conclusions. For example, we know that whole plant cannabis in laboratory animals leaves spasticity, muscle spasticity, as similar to what happens in multiple sclerosis MS than the isolates. So we know that the whole plant is working differently. And there's two terms that I discuss: therapeutic or clinical synergy versus pharmacologic synergy. And pharmacologically, we have too many things going on to know exactly what is doing what, but clinically, we can definitely measure effects, and we can also compare them with known synthetic reference drugs. So there's a lot that we know and that we can know, but this other piece, I think, is going to really be relying on artificial intelligence, network dynamics, and the computer in many ways. And AI is going to be the microscope of the future in terms of understanding all of these. And we are at the tip. So I give you guys a shout out to really being pioneers in this. Do you
Well, thank you.
have other favorite classifications of molecules other than cannabinoids, terpenes, for example, or flavonoids, or maybe alkaloids, mushrooms? Tell me a little bit about some other classes or class of these chemicals that you find interesting, fascinating, or useful.
Well, this is probably not a popular one to talk about, but the potential harmful things, right? I've had a lot of people
Absolutely.
ask us. I've had a lot of people ask us, and this goes hand in hand with what we're just talking about you know the potential interactions and the synergies and what's causing what, and will we ever know, because it's super complex, and it is. Right down to, we know to some extent based on the literature, there's about 2,600 plus compounds in cannabis smoke. I suspect there's probably more that we just haven't really discovered yet or even identified. But, you know, a lot of people have asked, well, so, are the bad things contributing to the effects? And I want to say this very generally and vaguely because, again, I don't know everything about this subject. I only know what I'm doing here in our lab and how we capture these things. We rely on other people to tell us more about what's actually going on. But my thought is, for instance, so this is a tough one. Terpenes, right? Terpenes are extremely important and they're amazing, and they do drive a lot of the subjective effects in general of the cannabis experience, especially when smoking. But my thought with terpenes is this: there is some evidence that terpenes specifically, even at pretty low temperatures, can transform into bad things.
Oh,
Namely,
yeah.
isoprene and benzene and I can never pronounce the other one. It starts with an M. More clean. Is it more clean here? Let me type it in. But regardless, there are some transformations at a fairly low temperature, and this has not been well studied or well documented. But myrcene, for example, it's very abundant in cannabis. It's very popular. We know a little bit about it, right? We know that it can be relaxing. We know it's found in other plants and
Yeah.
other herbs and spices. Myrcene at a fairly low temperature will transform into benzene. Benzene toxicity is essentially like lethargic, relaxed, sleepy. Those are similar symptoms or side effects that
Um,
people would expect to see from smoking myrcene heavy strains. And this isn't to point out to say, oh, that's bad, don't do that. These are just things that I'm reading. But my thought is, there is potential that in this case, right, maybe it's not just myrcene that's making you feel relaxed. Maybe it's also a little bit of benzene that you're inhaling and consuming. That's possible. I'm, not here to whistle blow. That's not what we do. But this is the stuff that we have to read about to be prepared to either learn about or overcome with other potential benefits. Because I always see the smoking as a net benefit, not just something that's potentially harmful. That's the way we look at it. But that's something, right? People have asked again, are the bad things causing some of the effects that might even be desirable? And my thought is, could be. Yeah, could be. I'm not going to say for certain, but the evidence is potentially there. Limonene also has been documented as turning into benzene at temperatures between vaporizing and smoking. Another one of my
oh
favorite
wow.
terpenes, by the way. More and how awesome and interesting they are. Beta caryophyllene, right? You mentioned that before. We did some research on roaches. We analyzed roaches from a big public consumption event. We had a couple hundred roaches. We analyzed the roach, and then we smoked the roaches with our method to see how things changed. And what we found was in the roaches, there was a huge accumulation of beta caryophyllene. And the point of this research was to see if, to see why roaches might feel different compared to the original joint that you rolled. And one of the big takeaways was that there is an abundance of beta caryophyllene in a roach. And is that contributing to your effect that you get from that? So I think terpenes are huge, and we don't know a ton about them yet as far as like what happens when we smoke them. My other thought here on the terpenes, if I can rant about them for a second, because I love
Yes.
a delicious smoke just like most, right? But my thought is this: you get a joint, you roll it up, and everybody likes to take a couple of pulls on it before you light it up, and it smells and tastes so good right there. When you spark it up, quick tidbit about a joint, it's the most chemically diverse way that you can smoke. So before, when you mentioned the difference between smoking a joint or smoking a bong, there is definitely parameters that would change the chemistry and that would make you feel potentially different even with the same exact strain or input material. But the joint is the most chemically diverse smoke. You get this hot ember on the end that's transforming big time. Then you've got hot air that's less and less hot towards the mouthpiece, that's in some forms vaporizing things right behind the joint, but right behind the ember, and in other ways decarboxylating and accumulating things like beta caryophyllene down towards the tip. So the joint is changing as you smoke it, and actually the chemistry is changing as well. That's really cool. My thought is this, right? If we know that the terpenes can disappear, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and we know others are going to degrade really easily because we have to, we all talk about storage conditions and how to properly treat your cannabis post harvest to not lose terpenes and such. I think we're getting a little bit of that aromatherapy when we're breathing in on a joint because the stuff down towards the mouthpiece is not burning and it's not decarbing or transforming yet. But then once you get down towards the end, it doesn't taste the same anymore and it doesn't feel the same anymore. If you put it out and spark it back up, it feels different. And I think that's because we've already experienced that transformation. These are my thoughts, by the way. I don't have like rock solid data or evidence to throw in anyone's face here, but I think it's pretty reasonable based on what we know.
I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I think also, cannabis is a social herb amongst other things. And one of the things I like about the joint, even though it's not sanitary and we're talking, it's the passing it around in the circle. I think that that's a phenomenally, it's a part of it that's different than passing the pipe. And so I think of it as an elegant thing. In
100%.
botanical medicine, especially in traditional Chinese medicine, is where this idea comes from. We know that certain herbs and drugs have toxic compounds and have toxic capacities. So some in the formulas that are made in Chinese medicine, one class of herb is called the envoy herb. So in Chinese medicine, and most botanical medicines, we're rarely using one herb at a time. We usually like to do combinations because of the potential for synergistic effects. And if you think of what an envoy is when you come from visiting from another country, you meet the envoy, and the envoy takes you to meet the emperor or the president or whomever. And it's so easy for us to make social faux pas, like, not taking our shoes off when we go into the house, those kinds of things. So the envoy is there to prevent the rudeness of the guest as part of that. And so in botanical formulas, licorice is a real great envoy herb because it can reduce some of the toxicity of the other compounds. And this is, I think, something that is hardly ever talked about in the conventional cannabis world, is that we talk about tobacco as enhancing a head high, but we can be using other botanicals to potentially mitigate some of the toxic effects. Anyways, just another thought that popped into my head.
Hey, here's a question for you.
Go ahead.
So just this week, actually, somebody was talking to me about how they eat a ton of licorice. This is just funny you mentioned licorice specifically, but they were talking about how they eat a ton of licorice, and they were on some medicine for, I want to say, blood pressure maybe, and then weren't feeling great and looked up online and found out that the licorice was actually a terrible thing to be eating, and especially so much of while they were taking some certain drugs. I had no idea that was such a serious interaction.
Great question. So let's talk about that. And we use this in the concept of synergy. Great question. So licorice, part of what licorice is an adaptogen. Part of its role is as an adaptogen. And what an adaptogen does is it helps us adapt to stress. And there is a chemical in licorice called glycyrrhizin that does not land. One of the chemicals that our adrenal glands pump out is called cortisol. Okay. And the glycyrrhizin does not land on the receptors that the cortisol is using, but it extends the half-life of cortisol. So when we eat licorice, our body's stress molecules last longer. And as a result, we have more of a robust response to stress without having to actually have our body make any more of the chemicals. One of the downsides of licorice is that by extending this half-life of cortisol, it can cause increased blood pressure. So this is why naturopaths excel at this, naturopathic doctors, as opposed to medical doctors who just do what you do and get online. No, you do not use licorice in a hypertensive patient. Good point. However, licorice is also really good for soothing the digestive tract. So if we have herbs that may possibly cause an upset stomach, but they have some, because of negative side effects, right? But they have some other positives, and we want to try and maybe sneak these through to get some help. You can get a deglycerated licorice that does not cause elevated blood pressure, but that can soothe the digestive tract. So, but it doesn't give you the cortisol extending properties, but you can still, the licorice can then be an envoy and say, we're going to get you through, we want to get this herb through the digestive tract and into where it is needed. Fantastic and excellent question. And
that's fascinating. And again, it's just funny you mentioned that, because I was just having this conversation yesterday, and I thought, wow, yeah, I'm blanking out on the name of what it was increasing or potentially increasing, hydrochlor something. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I thought, wow, this is a good opportunity to ask you another question then on this subject and the concept of synergies, and back to what I was saying before, the potential for actual things that might be harmful in isolation maybe being potentially in some ways helpful. Like, for example, before I ask this, certain stress is good, right? When you're growing plants, there's certain stress mechanisms that are going to cause the plants to do certain things and produce certain compounds and flower and all these things. So my thought is this, in regards to licorice, where was I just going with this? The stress. Oh, sorry. So what is your thoughts on the idea that potentially some of these in isolation, maybe harmful things, are acting as maybe an envoy or doing some minor forms of stress that might actually be helping us in some ways, right? Because if we never got stressed out, our bodies in any way, then we would be very weak. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on it.
Great question. There was an ancient Greek physician, I believe it was Galen, was his name, and he said, all things can be poisonous, but it is or they can be helpful, but it is the dose that makes them so.
Okay.
There's a certain type of a rat poison that we use to kill rats. And in humans, if we eat that rat poison, it could kill us too. But at the proper concentration, that rat poison is Coumadin, which is a blood thinner, which is a lifesaver. So within you can have a toxic chemical at a certain dose that it can be beneficial at another dose. I remember when I was very early in medical school, I had an obsessive compulsive patient. As I was saying goodbye to him and, sending him out the door, I said, make sure to drink as much water as you can. And at that level, the water flushed out his electrolytes, and he wound up in the emergency room because he had an arrhythmia in his heart. So even water in the wrong dose can be toxic. Also, we can have molecules that do things that we're not looking for. So there can be a traditional antibacterial herb that we can separate all the chemicals out, and we can say, oh, this is the particular chemical that kills the bacteria. And there's studies on this, and so if you isolate that and you give that to animals or humans, it can have antibacterial effect, but the bacteria may very quickly develop resistance to it. There can be another chemical in the plant that, if you're just looking at antibacterial effects, does nothing, but that plant may increase the amount or decrease the amount of a pump that the bacteria uses to spit out the antibiotic. So you use the combined molecules, and you give the antibiotic chemical, and you're turning the pump that the bacteria uses to detoxify itself off, and all of a sudden you have a magnified or synergistic effect. Go ahead.
Now I'm having a thought about my question and about what you just said. So it's not about the compound or the molecule itself, it's about the dosage that matters the most, right? And as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking, well, if you've got, you know, a huge mixture of different compounds, you're probably more likely to maybe not hurt yourself compared to if you're just eating something that's isolated, right? Like if you just,
I think that in the context of plants, because, and this is before heating, combustion, chemical derivation, etc., all of the molecules that the plant makes, they're making within a eukaryotic cell, a cell that is in many ways similar to our cells, so that the concentration or the toxicity of it in the living plant material is typically a lot less. And then if we take that, Andy, and we think about how are we making chemotherapy drugs effective and still dealing with their toxicity, the oncologists are doing the same thing. They will utilize a number of different chemicals to treat different biochemical pathways, and this one particular one might be very toxic, and but because there is a combinatorial effect, lower doses can be used, and it can be more efficacious or more stable on the system. Something that you or the viewers may want to look up is called network pharmacology, where it is the networks that are important, and how is something, instead of affecting an individual pathway, important, but how is it important in terms of how it's addressing the network.
it's fascinating. The last time we had this conversation, I really felt like inspired, like uplifted, like I really like put pieces together when we were having our conversation. But you know, we went from one random question to like three others that clicked with me. You know what I mean? I talk about all the time that I think that the mixtures and the magic is in the mixture. That's what we always say around here. And you know, we talk about how we do believe that these mixtures, you know, full spectrum, full plant flower is in a lot of ways more beneficial for me personally, and it seems to be for a lot of people than just isolated compounds. And then we know that when we burn those isolated compounds, they turn into a variety of other different things. So I just can't stop thinking about the idea that, you know, when you compare like pharmaceutical drugs to plant-based medicine, the obvious major differences are the isolated compound or even synthetically derived, but one thing versus a mixture of things. And my first thought was, oh, it's kind of like the throwing spaghetti at the wall and we'll see what sticks with the mixtures.
Yeah.
But then I've learned over the years that, well, it's a lot more than that. It's these combinations and how they are catalysts for other transformations and other reactions and modulating things. And it's much more complicated than I ever imagined. But it is, it makes me feel better about my choices as well. Because full disclosure, right? I told you this before. My interest in all this is purely based on my health issues that I've had, which I've got a rare neurological disease that doesn't have treatment options, doesn't have drugs, and I'm very involved with a group called the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation, where we're doing some research for finding potential pharmaceutical drugs for people in this population, and looking at orphan drugs to see what might work and that kind of thing. But that there are a variety of plants available to all these people today, right? I think there's almost 7,000 rare diseases, and there's only like 200 pharmaceutical drugs for those diseases. How many of these people, if they had the education or people like you to explain this stuff to them, might actually have some hope and say, wow, I can look to Mother Nature and maybe find something that at least gets me through the day or makes me feel better or whatever it is. So, you know, it's important to me to learn this stuff. I appreciate your time and explaining a lot of
Oh,
this.
my pleasure. I'm sorry, my headset went out. Can you hear me okay still?
I can hear you perfect. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, think about, you mentioned looking to nature, and think about what plants are doing with their chemicals. Plants will make chemicals to influence other organisms like the bacteria to turn them off. When they do that, they're using mixtures because of evolutionary pressure. They choose what works best over time scales that we are not used to as humans. So they make mixtures. Also, if I step on a plant when I'm in my yard, my raspberries are back over here and they're growing everywhere. And sometimes the plant will have to heal itself. And when plants heal themselves, they make anti-inflammatory molecules for themselves. But they rarely make just one molecule to do that. They make a host of them. And different plants in different environments will have different skill sets, and these will correlate or interact or change with humans. So when we look at what nature is doing, nature is almost always making mixtures because they work better for the long-term survival of the organisms. Otherwise, they would just be making one chemical. Anyway.
Oh no, this is something I was just talking about with my wife yesterday as well. But the difference in effect from cold brew coffee to just regular hot brewed coffee, right? We got some heat clearly changing something, right? It's changing the chemistry in some way. I prefer regular hot coffee. It just feels better. The cold brew makes me feel very jittery and potentially anxious and stressed out. I can't enjoy
Well,
it.
you're not pulling as many compounds out with the cold brew. Personally, I like an espresso because I don't like that heat on my beans too much. In fact, if I'm doing my own espresso, they say you're supposed to wait 40 seconds or whatever. I do it as fast as I can, which is usually takes about 20 to 30 seconds as opposed to 40, because I don't want that heat in with my beans too much. And for me personally, an espresso gives me a quick lift and then a quick run. But if I drink drip coffee, where that hot water just sits and sits, or percolated coffee, which I think is also delicious, there's a hierarchy. So for me, not to be snobby, but I like an espresso best. French press would be next. Percolated would be next. Drip would be next. Instant, which I'll do when I'm camping. And my least favorite is Turkish coffee. Anyway, that's personal preference. So isn't that interesting how we all relate to this drug?
Hey, there's a lot of similarities between the different varieties of coffee and the way to consume it and cannabis, as we're on the subject. But I am not the most mature coffee drinker yet in my life. I still have time. I have time to develop a better nose for it, like you. But
Well,
purely based on effects alone, which at the end of the day, I think a lot of people, when they do something, in my opinion, it's more about effects than it is about other things. And then once you get past that point, then you learn to appreciate things in another way, right? Like using cannabis, for example, up front, it was always about the effect. It was never about the connoisseur experience for me. But now over many, many years of using it and growing it and appreciating it, my behavior has changed a lot, and I appreciate different things about it, not just the effects.
Yeah. When I was a kid, you got what you got, and that's what you got.
Yep.
Stems and everything. So we're in a different era as far as that goes. And these plants change culture, and cannabis obviously has been a big culture shifter, and so has caffeine or coffee. If you look, caffeine or coffee came first to the Middle East and Persia in the 12th or 13th century. It didn't get to Europe until the 16th or 17th century. But when it got into Persia, we had a flowering of mathematics. All of a sudden, all of these beautiful, and it was also there are coffee shops. So it de-stratified the society. So you got the poor people and the rich people together. In Europe, when coffee came, it very much coincides with the very beginnings of industrialization in the industrial era. And coffee changes how we work, it changes how we live. And I was in downtown Aberdeen, rolling to surf at Westport, and the Starbucks opens at 5 a.m. I shouldn't have said the branding, but anyway, I just did, so I'm not going to take it back. But I was going in, and as I was going in, you know how somebody's going to beat you to the door, right? And I got beat to the door. These four people got out of a car, and they walked in, and they were, I don't know if they were hungover or what, but they walked in, and they weren't really saying much. But okay, there you go. They beat me to the thing. They get their coffee. I get my coffee. I split. I'm back in my van. And they come walking out of the coffee shop, and they're like, da, 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 da. Everybody's chit chatting. It's a social drug as well. And caffeine, when combined with cannabis,
there's a magical combination right there.
Is the way that the body processes pain. So you get a little more pain relief from cannabis when you take it with caffeine. Anyway,
that makes a lot of sense. And, it's definitely a great way to start the day.
Well, hey, listen, I know you've got a meeting coming up at the top of the hour. I want to profoundly thank you. I will share this with you. I'll share the uncut version with you, and then I'll probably put it up on YouTube within the next 48 hours, if not sooner. And then I'm going to splice it up so folks can feel free to like, share, etc. How can people find out more about you or your company?
Well, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. That's where we met, obviously. So I run the Real Isolates LLC page. I'm on there as well, Andrew Westerkamp. I'm Andy. I don't know why I still go by Andrew. I'm Andy. But you can find us on Instagram too. Smoke and All, that's our cannabis touching brand. Profound Naturals, it's our hemp touching brand. And yeah, you can find us on our website as well, www.realisolates.com or smokeandall.com. It's the same domain. Please, visit, reach out with questions. We're an open book for the most part. And, we're just, again, I said it from the beginning, we're just touching the tip of an iceberg here. We don't know everything. If we know one thing, we know that we don't know very much, which sounds silly. But, the more you know, the less you know sometimes. We've just learned that there's a lot more here than we ever imagined. So, if people are interested in collaborating or doing research or working with us in any way, please reach out. We'd love to talk to you.
Thank you. And Socrates said that the not knowing is the beginning of wisdom, and that's fascinating.
Well, thank you for your time. This was great. I enjoyed this a lot. I hope anything I said or we said is interesting for people out there, and I would love to talk to you more often.
We'll do it again, and this time I promise I'll have a better internet connection. I want to apologize to any of our listeners if it's cutting in and out. Hopefully we got most of this. Good luck with the rest of your day, Andy. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well. I'll talk to you soon.